All right, so every year when we do air pollution, I bring in a guest speaker to my class to talk about air quality and how it's monitored. And luckily, my guest speaker is still accessible to me. So we have a guest speaker today. This is Mark Adair, who works with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and he's going to tell us about air monitoring and air compliance.
Hi. So I'm happy to do this little presentation for y'all. I just did a practice run and it went way longer than the 15 minutes that this allows. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go kind of fast. And if you have any other questions, you can just email Mrs. Adair. And I will either if we have a lot of questions, I'll do a quick follow-up where I can maybe answer them. Or I can just email you back and answer them specifically. So we will get started. The first slide here, it's just some general information about the TCEQ. Like I said, I won't read that all to you all, so you can just pause if you're really interested in that. This is our region, Region 5. Here's offices here in Tyler. As you can see, it's 23 counties here in the northeast corner of the state. So these are just the major duties of this office. We have an air, water, and waste program. And you see each of those things below. We're going to cover in slides later on with the complaints and the violations and all that. So we will keep moving on. The air quality section, which I am in, there's 2,400 known sources. We put known because that is subject to change. It can go up and down a lot depending on, a lot of people around here are involved in the oil industry. So when the oil's good, there's a lot of additional facilities that open up. When the market's bad, there's a lot of them that close down. So that number can fluctuate a lot. And then there's 150 major sources in the area. And like I said, we'll talk more about those in just here a little bit. So this is just a quick little guide, kind of the different levels of air permitting. De minimis is at the top. In case you don't know Latin, all that means is the minimum. So those are just the lowest level of what we would even look at. And it goes all the way down to that last bottom part of the pyramid, Title V and PSD. That's what we would call major sources. So everything below that or above that in this graph, from state permit to de minimis are minor, and the Title V is what we would call a major source. So the criteria pollutants, those are listed there. I know Mrs. Adair has talked to you all about that before. We also looked at hazardous air pollutants and view major versus minor. And there's just a little more information about that below it. So de minimis is just, from learning about the Clean Air Act, all air pollution needs to be permitted in some form or fashion. So de minimis is just everybody saying like these are issues that are so minor and negligible that we're really not concerned with them. If you're using spray paint to paint a fence in your backyard, you are generating air pollution, but it's not enough to really cause a problem if you're just doing it one time. Same thing as if you have something like a diesel generator at your house. You run that generator, you're creating what we call NOx. I think they are just normally talks about NO plus NO2, that equals NOx. We normally just call it that. So you are generating NOx when you're running that diesel generator, but when you're only running it, maybe you run it 40 hours a year or something, or it's just a real small, few horsepower generator, you're really not creating enough emissions to cause major problems where you really need to undergo permitting. The next level up is permits by rule. These are just written into rules. They're very common industries that don't generate a lot of emissions, but enough that they would need a permit that could cause problems if they weren't run right. Some very common ones are like auto body shops. So it's easy to get, they have all the conditions of do this, have a paint booth, have ventilation, have a stack on top, don't use these type of paints that, have terrible things in them. And you can have the PBR. Some of those for like the auto body shops, you do have to apply for and pay a small fee to get, and that permit will last you 10 years. There are some very small permit by rules. A lot of them are within larger industrial sources that you just have to follow the conditions of that permit by rule. And as long as you're following them, then that's fine. You don't have to do any additional work to apply with us. Above that is the standard permits. And for y'all, they're pretty much the same as PBRs. It's very industry-specific type activities that have a very known process, and it's just kind of do this, and apply for it, and you'll be fine. The next level up is some people call them state permits. Normally we call them NSR permits. That stands for New Source Review. I didn't mention one of the other slides I meant to. Everywhere you see 30 TAC, that stands for Texas Administrative Code. So the air rules that we use for the state of Texas, the TCEQ, are found from 30 TAC 101 to 30 TAC 122. So the NSR permits, those are site-specific permit. Each one of those is written for the site. So these are big enough facilities like Delic here in Tyler on the Loop. If y'all have ever seen it, it has several NSR permits that were specifically written telling them to do specific things at that plant, telling them specifically how much they can emit from certain ports in that plant. I know y'all talked about Eastman a little bit because y'all were supposed to go on a field trip there before that. Eastman has somewhere around 30-something NSR permits for all sorts of several different, units around their plant. And like I said, those are all written just for them. And that process can take a long time. It can even take years sometimes. Another thing I forgot to mention on the last one with the PBRs is all permits that you're trying to get from the state, you must get that permit before you even start construction. This isn't something where you start, once you get your business up and going, you get the permit. You're supposed to get it before you even break ground, start pouring a slab and stuff like that for that business. And that's one of the things we'll talk a little more about. But if we go out and find somebody, that has built their business and not getting a permit, that's something that we can either write just a violation for, or we can even fine them money for, depending on the situation. And then there's the federal operating or the Title V permit. These are the largest ones, but it can be a little confusing because the Title V permits have very little new information in them. There are some small requirements that they put in there, but most of what a Title V permit is doing is just gathering up all the other requirements that you would need to follow. So I mentioned Eastman earlier. There's 15 different Title V permits at that facility for Eastman. And so, like, individually, one of those Title V permits could have, say, 4 NSR permits that are covered under that Title V. And then they also might have 5, 6, 7, maybe even 10 PBRs that are covered under that Title V. And that Title V just draws them all together and says, okay, like when you go to the ethylene oxide or the ethylene glycol unit at Eastman for that Title V permit, here's all the things you need to look at permit-wise. It will also list if there's any other state rules that you should be looking at. And there's also 40 CFR, which is the Federal Code of Federal Regulation, 60, 61, and 63. We have to look at all those too. Those are a lot of the air regulations. So it will list any of those sections of those rules that particular unit might cover. And so they're really it's a lot for us just to know, like, we pulled everything together and shown, like, this is why, this is everything you need to know for this certain facility. So compliance investigations, that's a lot of what we do. There's 2 types. There's on-site investigations and in-house investigations. So obviously, with it being air pollution, I can't just drive up to a facility and, look at the stacks and know how much is coming out of it and know if they're, violating all their permits. And I didn't mention earlier, too, I meant to, a lot of those permits have other things, not just how much they can emit. It has lots of records. Well, like, if you have a thermal oxidizer to reduce your emissions, then that has to run a certain way. There has to be certain flows to it. Like, your flares have certain flows to it, and the pilot has to be lit and a certain BTU level at the flare head to meet all your compliance. So we look at lots and lots of records. So a lot of the records are required to send to me at the office. So a lot of the compliance investigations I do in-house, but the on-site ones, I go to the facilities. They know I'm coming, like I said, because they're all on compliance schedules once they get these Title V. And most of these are Title V. I can't remember if I said that at the beginning. We will do some NSR ones occasionally, but the larger ones, they know we're on a schedule to come out there every so often. So I'll call and tell them, a couple weeks before, and they'll get all the information together, and we'll sit down together, go through it all, and then I'll walk through the plant with them to look for different things to make sure they're running it as they should, in compliance with those permits and state and federal rules. Permit review is actually during the permitting process. So like I said, all the permitting goes through Austin. And so it's a little bit of us helping out Austin. So for one, when they do modeling and stuff like that in Austin, depending on what you're building, if you're building a site that has lots of hazardous chemicals and, lots of hazardous emissions, you want to know where they're putting it. So the company might send in a satellite map that shows there's nothing around, but as y'all know from playing on Google Earth and stuff, those maps can be several years old. So one of the things we can do a lot of times is drive out there and verify, there's not like a nursing home or a daycare across the street from this facility, that they are far enough away from places like that they need to be. And then also before the permits are issued, we can read over them just to see if there's anything the permit engineer missed or didn't think about that us being the actual boots on the ground, seeing like we'd have trouble enforcing this, or this business, it might be hard to put that kind of restrictions on them. So we do a good number of permanent reviews. I wish I knew a number, but there's not a ton during the year, but there's a good number of them. Mission event investigations, these can be very interesting. There's a lot that goes on with these. So these are basically when something goes wrong. Like I said, your permanent emissions, but this is when something bad happens. It could be a fire. It could be when something breaks and, spews out a bunch of gas. A pressure relief valve is a lot of times an emission event. And those investigations are for the company to try to say it's not our fault, don't fine us. And that's how we review them. So they can say, we've been doing everything right. And, sometimes we just have a lot of equipment. Your car, when you're driving it, sometimes breaks down. Well, sometimes this equipment breaks down. So if they have something break and they have a lot of emissions, but they show that it really wasn't their fault, it's just kind of one of those things that happens, then I can just go ahead and write it off and excuse it. But if it's one of those things where it happened due to their negligence or bad maintenance or things like that, operator error, then I won't do that. Depending on how much the emissions are, we'll either just write a violation or we'll fine them. Stack testing is required by a lot of big industries. So a lot of these major stacks, there's no real economically feasible way to constantly be monitoring emissions from them. Some do have constant emissions monitoring, some don't, but the ones that don't, even the ones that do, occasionally we make a third party come in and bring a whole bunch of specialized equipment. They hook it up to the actual stack where all the emissions coming out, and they run a whole bunch of tests to see what they are, and then that's how we'll know if that company's in compliance. And that is also how we figure out some of the other operational parameters that the business should be running at to say, like, this is how you stay in compliance. When you were running exactly like this and we had all that stack testing equipment on there, you were in compliance. So run your plant like that and you'll be fine. Complaints, these come from citizens. They can be about anything, odor, dust, outdoor burning. We get all sorts of crazy complaints. You can call, people, a lot of it's people just mad at their neighbors, but we go out on several a year. Sometimes we write violations, sometimes we don't. Like I said, outdoor burning is a big one in East Texas. People trying to burn tires and wires and things like that. Obviously, you can't do that. So we go out there and see what's going on and see what we can do about it. We also have CAM stations, it's continuous ambient monitoring stations. There's 6 of them in our region. And these are just random little sites set up with air pollution monitoring equipment to just kind of get the background level so we know what's out there, what's around, and monitor the air quality in this region. The big one is ozone. If you ever hear about ozone action days and stuff like that, and that's where they get the data from, is these CAM stations. And emergency response, we also do that. This is large spills, industrial fires and stuff like that. We'll help the company and other entities and other state and federal regulators, figure out how to best mitigate and clean up and remediate these sites after they've had some sort of disaster situation. Or some of them aren't even disasters. A lot of them is tank derailments and like tanker trucks flipping on the highways, but still it has to be cleaned up, and that's part of our job to go out there and make sure that it's done properly. And so that's it. I made it just a minute and a half left.
You're good.
So like I said, if you have any of those questions, there's actually my email. You can email me directly, or you can email Mrs. Adair, and I will answer those later on.
Yeah, he's bored. Give him something to do.
I'm not bored.
He's not bored. He's not bored.